Hello and welcome back to Season 5 of the MRX Lab podcast, the show from FlexMR, where this year we're on a mission to uncover the many ways market research connects with the world around us and learn how to navigate a fast-changing business landscape. I'm excited today to be joined by Iain Stanfield, Insight Lead at Specsavers, the British multinational optical retail chain that's been a high street staple for 40 years. Iain, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the introduction.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here. But before we jump into the topic we're going to speak about today, it would be great if you could maybe share a brief introduction to your journey through the research industry and your role at Specsavers today.
Of course, I'll keep it brief because it goes on for about 30 years now. So but over that time I've worked predominantly in research roles or research-based roles. I fell into the sector and despite at one point thinking that I wanted to get into a more sexy marketing role rather than the dull and dusty world of market research, I did dip out for a couple of years and then realized that actually I missed all of the research bits of it, so I then embraced it. My background is predominantly research agencies, so some of the big ones that most people will have heard of, the Cantars, the GfKs of the world, although it's called Millward Brown when I was at Kantar. I also spent 5 years as an ad planner at Ogilvy & Mather, and I've been at Specsavers for just coming up to 6 years now.
Wow, very experienced, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of change over that time as well.
I have, yes. I mean, back when my first day in research, I was stood on Surbiton railway station handing out mailback questionnaires about what are now travel cards to commuters, so that basically what at the time was British Rail and London Transport could work out who got the money for that just came in as a sale of a travel card. So yeah, quite a change. So that was a mailback survey. A lot of people listening probably have never even heard of a mailback survey. But yeah, it's been quite a lot of change, although some things don't change at all. The surveys that we do and the way we write questions on panels like FlexMR probably haven't changed that much. And I suppose at the end of the day, what we do as a business hasn't changed that much. We're still trying to understand people.
Yeah, and that's what it's all about. Understanding. We can innovate the technologies, the tools we use, but human behavior is, the one great thing we're all here to understand.
Absolutely.
So I remember when we were talking about putting this episode together, one of the challenges you mentioned client-side researchers often face is it's a very human challenge. It's about getting recognition for the right research skills. So I'm really interested. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I suppose this is one of the differences when you move from an agency side role where you work in a company where the majority of people are research practitioners and skilled research practitioners into a client side role where virtually no one is a skilled research practitioner. That's your role, and so it's quite difficult because you're often given questions, and the person who's giving you those questions or problems to answer doesn't really understand that one of those is really simple and I can probably get an answer, even if it requires primary research, in a day or a couple of days, especially if it's something that can go on our customer panel, which you manage for us. Other things can take literally months to get an answer to, but in their eyes, they often see them as virtually, one was one question, one was another question. how come I can get something this week on one and I can't get anything for many weeks on this other topic, which seems to be, from their point of view, a very similar question. So it's that sort of thing can be quite a challenge, because, as I'm sure most people listening will appreciate and will suffer from the same thing, is that we don't all have infinite amounts of time in which to respond to the requests or the projects or the topics that we're doing, and therefore that constant sort of management of stakeholders is quite a key thing. And I say, just that whole thing of, well, why can't I get an answer to that question this weekend when you're quite happy to give me one to this other question? So that's often quite a challenge.
Yeah, so maybe an unfair question, but what can you do about that? How do you manage those expectations?
Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One is, and this is the ultimate, is that you realize that person is going to ask the question 2 months before they ask it, and therefore you are prepared with the answers, so that actually all you're doing is curating some data that you already have, rather than taking it from the moment they ask the question to go out and find that data. There are things that you can do to help educate people, but that would be the ultimate, to be close enough to your key stakeholders, to be close enough to the needs of the business, the category that you work in, the discussions that are happening, so that you can foresee where the questions are going to come from, and that's the skill that I say, despite the fact that I'm 6 years in at Specsavers, I'm still working out, because every time someone changes in the senior leadership team, you sort of start to gain a little bit with what type of questions they're going to ask, where they're coming from. But that's the ultimate one. In terms of, if you can't do that, then sometimes giving people an option of, I can get you something that's not what you've quite asked for, but might answer the question that you've got, or the decision that you're trying to inform, with some evidence. And therefore there can be a bit of a trade-off there, in that sometimes what they're actually after, or the degree of information that they need to make a decision, can be different to what they've originally asked for, and therefore that can change the timescales and the dynamics of the solution that you're able to come up with. So there are a few things that you have at your disposal, rather than just magically being able to put the rest of the world on hold while you spend those couple of months coming up with the answer. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting, that both the things you've mentioned there are, first, on the idea of kind of compromise. I've seen it really often where, as researchers, it's so easy to get caught up in answering the question that was asked, that you forget to take a step back and say, what does this person really need? How much of that question do they need? Where would they be willing to compromise to make the decision? Because that's really what it's about. It's a decision being made, not the specific question they're asking in the moment. And then on the other front, the idea of developing this operational foresight is a very different skill set to what we're used to as researchers. We like to think we're good at understanding people, behavior, customers, consumers, whereas really we also need to reflect that inwards and be close enough to our organizations to be able to say, I know the people, the ways of working, to predict what this business is going to need in 2 or 3 months' time. But that does bring me on to another question, which is, I suppose, around this idea of the very short-term tactical projects. compared against the insight which is more strategic and long term. How do you balance those two competing needs?
It's a really good point, Chris. Because interestingly, if you saw our value as an insight team, quite a small insight team within Specsavers, and you judged our value to the business based on those long-term versus the short-term questions. If you ask me, I would say our value is almost all in the longer-term questions. The vision, where should we be going? What are the key needs for the brand? What are the key ways we need to evaluate and evolve our customer experience? If you asked a lot of my stakeholders and said, you know, what does the insight team do really well, it would all be the short-term stuff. And I don't think that's necessarily because of who Specsavers is and how we operate. I have heard and seen, I suppose, from an agency perspective, that retail does tend to be quite quick turnaround. It's all about last week's trading figures, and although we're a part retail, part healthcare brand, our mentality is certainly from a trading perspective is very much like a retailer. So I think some categories move quicker than others, but I've spoken to colleagues in other businesses, and they go, weekly sales, I get daily sales, I get daily signups. I spoke to somebody in an automotive company, and they were saying, oh yeah, we have a session every morning for 15 minutes just to see how many cars we sold yesterday. So I don't think we're unique in that. I think there is that bit in the middle, though, which is the answer to the question. The answer to the question might be quite quick. The fact, as I mentioned before, the fact that you sought to provide yourself and arm yourself with the data to answer that question in advance is sort of where that skill comes. So that actually you are feeling as though you're being very responsive, but that's because you've built up an arsenal of data that will answer the majority of the questions that you're going to get quite short term, or you have shortcuts for getting hold of data through making sure that you've got self-serve tools to enable you to interrogate and analyze some of the data sources that you that are going to provide the answers to those questions.
It's an interesting point. I've seen it sometimes be considered almost a threat to what we do in research to have a library, a repository of data, because the value is in we speak to customers, we speak to consumers, we bring fresh, relevant data. But the reality is that there's a lot of people, especially in today's environment, where we're constantly hearing about kind of the time and cost pressures on insight teams, where there are too many questions to answer and not enough resources to do it. So in a way, it's almost about being choiceful about which questions need your attention and new, fresh data right now, and which can be drawn from a repository or built in advance. At least that's one of the ways I like to think about it.
Yeah, I think, again, understanding, and there's a bit of education in this for stakeholders as well, understanding what moves quickly and what moves slowly is quite key. Understanding, therefore, where you need to be on top of the latest data rather than just being on top of thorough data is I suppose is one of the skills that you bring to the role. And you know, the categories that we're in, if the question is around trading performance in one of the bits of the business, then you need to be on top of the latest data for that. If it's what people don't like about wearing contact lenses, that doesn't really change that much. So, you know, what are the frustrations people have with the category? How do the, you know, what are the concerns that they have when they are thinking about getting a sight test, for instance? Again, don't really change that much, and therefore understanding where those buckets lie, and therefore, as you say, putting your attention into keeping the evidence based of the long-term ones still up to date, but not sort of bang up to date, versus the trading ones where you probably, you know, if you're a couple of months out, actually that's actually not particularly useful, and can actually be harmful, because you can either be worrying about something that doesn't exist, or be missing something that possibly you should be worrying about or addressing.
Yeah, it reminds me of the parallel with marketing as well. Binet and Field's long and short of it, that, you know, if you want to be successful in the long run, you really have to balance in the marketing world, short-term sales activations, long-term brand building. It's about being able to operate both of those levers at speed and levers of speed, and understand that brand building is slow. It doesn't change much. It takes time. Sales activations are short, quick, but can't be sustained. It feels like there's a really strong parallel with the way you can manage insight there.
I think it's a really interesting parallel, because I think, yes, if you speak to my colleagues in the marketing department, they are constantly trying to balance out longer term brand building, awareness building, consideration driving, reappraisal type messaging with who's going to get somebody in to have a sight test next week, tomorrow, today. And I think it's, in a way, that can be quite helpful, because a lot of my stakeholders are from the marketing world, and therefore you can start to use those parallels to go, that's sort of working in my world as well, and they get it. It's more when you're into the operational side of the stakeholder groups that they just don't really understand the longer term need for things. But again, sometimes it's just a case of explaining what you need to do. Sometimes you will big up the ask that people have, and therefore sort of say, well, surely if you're going to make this decision that potentially could be about spending millions of pounds, do you really want me to rush into bringing you an answer in the short term? And sometimes that can help refocus things. Again, you can also sometimes understand what's driving the need for the speed and the urgency, and understanding, right, okay, so you've got these things are happening, and therefore that's why this is now an urgent thing, rather than something that you're, you know, that we're more in control of setting the deadline on. And again, that can sometimes help you understand what sorts of things they need now versus what maybe they may be able to wait for. As a colleague of mine works in an insurance for an insurance brand, and he always says that, you know, if he gets asked for a question, he says he always says to his stakeholders, the quicker you need the answer, the less robust I feel about the answer that I give you. You can have it quick, but it's going to have a lot more caveats than the thing that I have a bit longer to prepare and source from, I suppose, a broader suite of research tools.
I suppose in that sense, it's really about building shared understanding as well, about, you know, from your side and from stakeholders, where the trade-offs lie. And if you can reach that point of shared understanding, then people can make informed decisions about what kind of data they need.
Yes, and a lot of it, I mean, a lot of it is about relationships. So most things in business are always about relationships, whether you're talking about agency-client relationships, whether you're talking about senior stakeholder relationships, and a lot of it is about trust, and it comes down to trust of, I suppose, where I need to get to and where I want to get to with all of my stakeholders is for them, when they say I need it tomorrow and I say it's going to take a month, they go, okay, Ian, I trust you. If that's what you say it is, then that's what we'll do. I have something I need tomorrow. What can we do together to get something that will satisfy that? And then you get into that debate. But it is all around, I say, basically trust and sort of trying to politely point out that this is my job. It's not their job. But if I'm saying it's not possible, then there's a good reason why it's not possible.
Well, we are approaching the end of our time together today. So, in the interest of trust, what's the one thing you'd really like our audience to remember from today's episode?
I think the key thing, well, there's probably two things. One is around that building a rapport, building an understanding with your stakeholder group so that you can have those discussions rather than it be a bit more of an order taking sort of relationship, and therefore you can have that dialogue. I think you made a good point and summarized one of the things I was saying. I think the other thing is challenge politely, challenge with respect, but challenge the question if it's not quite clear as to go, is that really what you want now? Is that really what you're after? Or let's find out what the situation you're in and what context it is that you've come with that question, because it might be that there's actually a different way of solving the question that they hadn't thought of. But then that's part of why we have insight teams within businesses.
Excellent. Yeah, really interesting note to end on. I've really enjoyed today's discussion. Ian, thank you so much for joining today's episode.
Not a problem. Thanks for inviting me to speak, Chris.
Of course. And of course, thank you to everybody listening as well. We will be back next month with Billy Budd from the Coventry Building Society to explore some of the practical ways that AI is impacting research and insight teams today. But until then, I've been your host, Chris Martin, and this has been the MRX Lab.